Playing arcade boards at home using devices called superguns is getting more popular each year. As a result, more people are looking for easy ways to use controllers they already own on their superguns with no lag, and my favorite way is to direct wire your own stick. Here's a quick overview of how and why you might want to mod your own controller for arcade use. Almost every arcade platform out there, including both home and arcade versions of the Neo Geo, use momentary switches for each of their buttons. Everything from the start button to the game buttons to even all 4 positions of the stick each connect to an individual switch. All of the switches are then wired together to share the same ground signal, then each of the main signals are connected to the arcade board's harness. This basic signal-to-ground function is how arcade boards can process the inputs with essentially zero latency, and it's also why you could use the same controller and supergun on almost every JAMMA board out there. Almost all gamepads also process a button push by connecting a signal to ground. However, they're sent into a chip that outputs a signal compatible with each individual console. Displaced Gamers has a great video about this for people who are interested, but we're going to keep things on topic in this video. How do you interface those controllers, or basically any connected, disconnected momentary switch, to an arcade board? The answer is to simply connect those switches to the same style connector that people use with superguns, a Neo Geo style DB15 connector. People have been doing this for years to either build their own controllers from arcade parts, or simply to modify any existing controller that's compatible. To make this process easier, Tianfeng has created a board that breaks out each pin on the DB15 connector and labeled each one. I'd like to show some examples of how I used it. First, here's an old but reliable PlayStation 1 arcade stick. I was able to tap into its circuit board and use a multimeter to find out which pads are ground and which are signal for each button, even the little start and select buttons on top. I wired them directly into the controller and tested with my superguns. No problems at all. The existing circuit board didn't interfere with the direct connections at all, and as long as I don't try to connect it to both a PlayStation and a supergun at the same time, it should be fine. Here's a Mortal Kombat arcade stick for the PS3 that worked a bit differently. First, I wasn't able to tap into the buttons on top, so I added separate coin and start buttons in back. These actually turned out to be too long with everything fully assembled, but I switched them out with Sanwa buttons and it fits fine. Just make sure to measure the stick you're using and not be lazy like me. Next, none of the grounds seemed to match. Whoever manufactured these controllers didn't keep the layout consistent, so I had to manually check each button and make sure the signal wire was on top and the grounds were all on the middle pin. After that, the stick worked, but the buttons all showed as being pressed when using the DB15 output. It appears all the signal wires are run into a chip on the controller board that interferes with the signal. And once again, we're making sure not to use both outputs at the same time. It still interfered when only the DB15 input was plugged in. In order to isolate the signal, I added diodes to the wires that connect the PS3's controller board. This will allow the signal from the button to still flow to the controller chip, but it will block any shorting on the chip from coming back up the line into the DB15 connector. Now it's all wired up and working, and it even still works as a PS3 controller. Just, once again, don't plug them both in at the same time, of course. You can wire gamepads the same way too, but since there's a lot less room to work, it's a bit trickier. I'd just cut a DB15 cable in half and wire it directly to the pins each button connects to. Of course, this will make the controller strictly a DB15 controller and it will completely ruin its original use, so definitely stick to modding third-party ones and not originals. Alternatively, you could use this method for the opposite goal. I have a mini arcade machine running a real arcade board and wanted a way to use external controllers to give 2 players more space. I wired the connector to the existing buttons, and now I could use either the built-in stick or external controllers. More on this mini arcade in a future video, though. One thing to note is the pinout of the D-sub connector is based on if you're using it as an input or output. As you can see here, pin 1 is on the top right of the receptacle connector, which connects to pin 8 of the plug connector. Tianfeng's board has the pins marked on both sides of the board, so you can just read the orientation depending on which connector you're using. Also, buttons 5 and 6 might need to be wired differently based on your supergun, So I'd verify the connections in an arcade board service menu as well as reference the pinouts, just to be sure. Before I go, I definitely need to mention the Undamped Converters. These awesome little devices convert USB to DB15 for supergun use and pretty much don't add any lag at all. In fact, I tested one scenario on an oscilloscope and measured only around 1 millisecond of lag. That's incredibly fast. If your existing controller is compatible with the undamped solution, I'd just skip all the modding and use that instead. For more info and configuration options, check out the websites linked in the description. So that's pretty much it, a basic way to wire almost any controller for direct use with superguns. And this will work on anything with a momentary switch, so control pads, control sticks, hitboxes, or even keyboards for people that prefer to use that to compete with. And it's my opinion that if you're a casual supergun user, it's still something I would look into, but if you compete in tournaments, I would absolutely have your favorite stick wired with direct inputs. It really would remove any kind of configuration, button mapping, or most syncing and confusion when it comes to using controllers with retro stuff and superguns. All you'd have to do is wire it to the Neo Geo standard, then figure out what buttons 5 and 6 are going to be wired to on your supergun. There's about 3 different configurations, so if you're worried about that at all, you could install switches and jumpers and stuff to make it much easier. So if there is any need for configuration, you could just flick a switch before you get to a tournament. But overall, I really think it's worth the effort because this is a lag-free, basic way to get yourself an excellent arcade experience. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this one, please consider signing up for any of my support services like Patreon or Floatplane. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and check out the weekly podcast to be kept in the loop of everything going on in the retro gaming scene. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.